paid for everybody, and I've got this terrible health insurance. Somebody's getting something that I don't have, and that's their perception.
Yes, exactly. And I have written a question here in the middle of page 133. Is racism promoted by business and government? That's the hard question. Do they actually promote racism?
No.
And they don't answer that question. They partially do. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think what white people are having so much trouble with now is the civil rights leveled the playing field, at least to as much as possible, before backlash started taking it back. But for the first time ever, white men were finding themselves competing with people of color and women because of civil rights. They, up until the 60s, there was no civil rights, and there was no competition out there. They had it wide open. Now they have to work a little harder, that's all, because there's more competition. And I think some people really complain about that. They think it's really unfair because it's a big change for them. I mean, I noticed that when I moved here from California, and the only men I knew, they may have been white, but they were hippies, they were beatniks, they were other kinds of people. They were not earning tons of money. I came out here, and all these men, perfectly ordinary, not even especially well educated, are earning a ton of money. They and their families live very comfortably because they worked most of their lives without any competition from anybody else.
Right.
And it was so different. I said, why didn't I get one of these guys? I would have had a house, you know. My kids would have all gone to college. But you know, I think a lot of people liked the status quo and didn't want to see it change. And when it did, they started to complain. Not fair, not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it leads to backlash.
It's the fear, it's the fear that they're going to lose.
Well, they do.
Lose out.
And if they're good enough to compete, they'll still, you know, it just means there's more people competing, which is, I guess, capitalism.
And that applies to the fear of refugees too, I suppose.
Oh, well, except most refugees, especially Mexicans, tend to take the lower paying jobs, and they'll do the jobs that they can't find white folks to do those jobs. Like out in the fields in California, they would bring in the migrant workers because they tried once. They outlawed the migrant workers, and the crops rotted in the fields because they couldn't find any local white guys to go in there and bring in the crops.
Yes.
And
Well, this page 133 that you cite, I noticed that they cite Michelle Alexander's notable book called The New Jim Crow. With respect to how racism shapes our actions at the systematic level, in The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander contends that the United States criminal justice system itself operates in a way that inevitably leads to social divisions and disproportionate incarceration rates based on race. And later in their book, when they're talking about the new society, they bring up the abolition of prisons, period, which they've done in Finland. So, they abolish prisons as we understand prisons. Even murderers have apartments.
Sweden is close to them too.
They have nice apartments, living room, bedroom, kitchen, and then no fence around the prison, around the rehabilitation place. But they bring up abolishing prisons. Well, in other words, as I said, this book is so dense that if you look on each page, you might find answer answer there. I'm sorry, I can't remember where they have actually discussed it. But if you just follow their principles, they're trying to walk their principles down to social changes that are consistent.
Well, I guess that's, okay, go ahead.
There's a principle here that I have not heard even mentioned today, and that I hear mentioned and discussed less and less in recent times, although the threats we're under suggest that this particular principle is something we really need to consider at this point, because there's a great possibility of violence in the kinds of situations you're talking about rich people having their perks taken away and expecting this and that. And in trying to so massively change the capitalist system, massive change always brings massive resistance. There's a huge threat of violence in all of this. Physical violence, just simple hitting people and shooting people and so forth. And I think that the principle we have not been thinking much about, and I just haven't heard that much about it since about the 60s, is peace. That's the first word in the title for peace, justice, and ecology. And it's the first thing statistics here is peace. I don't think we're emphasizing or talking enough about peace. For one thing, we sound like we're angry at the capitalists. That's not a very, being angry at the people themselves is not a peaceful attitude. There are many ways in which I just think that principle should be much higher on the list than it is. Because if it's not a peaceful revolution, it's not going to work. It's going to fall apart and be worse than if we hadn't even tried.
Oh, well, none of them mentioned anything but nonviolence in their change. But they're angry, and anger is not, do you think it's a bad thing?
Anger at the situation.
No, anger at the thieves.
Don't be angry at the people, be angry at the situation.
Well, it's a high mark.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's important. I'd just like to see that side of it emphasized more than I have generally seen.
We have a very angry president right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
He's ready to just fight everybody, it
For sure,
seems,
yeah.
including us, and as well as everyone in the world. Kind of scary.
Well, I do think, Art, that having these conversations now really puts us in a much different position where we have learned to articulate the reason we see nonviolence as critical to this, because you're right, it's not connected to what's going on, and it's not nearly enough about what's the changes going on with climate change and the social breakdown that's happening and the right-left polarization that's been going on. All these things are just create such a huge tension that I agree with you fully that conversation needs to be a much bigger part of what's going on.
You're talking about, everything hinges on ending capitalism. Of course, that is the central question. How can we do this? I mean, how do you do that without violence? How do we do it? I mean, well, capitalism just has to collapse and we rebuild with what remains, or does he suggest like these transition movements, and little by little these different communities begin to develop new systems, and you learn new processes and ways of living in these smaller communities? What does he suggest as a way of ending that?
That you're going to have to do what Bernie did. At the very, very end, he says, now look, I don't mean that we shouldn't continue to change in every way we can on every level of society. So,
The mass movement, he's talking about the mass movement.
But that's their main principle. But until we can get a mass movement, we're going to have to do it incrementally. And so that's why I said earlier that you can't finally tell much difference between these two persons. these three persons or four persons. Yes, Gene?
I sort of have a different take on that. I think that there is a really clear difference between Magdoff and Williams, and I haven't read Bernie's book, I just, sort of know about it and everything.
But it's about reform.
And I haven't read this book of Klein's, but I've read others, but I see, Bernie's position and Naomi Klein's position as still on the reformist end of things. And
Yes.
Magdoff and Williams are very clearly revolutionaries. They clearly want to get rid of capitalism. They, the whole book says that just as clearly as they possibly can.
Absolutely.
Which is not anything that Bernie does. It's not anything that Naomi Klein does. That is a huge difference between the two, the three, whatever. I kept waiting in reading Magdoff and Williams to see, well, what are they gonna, how do we do this? And they finally, in the last chapter, and if you want a full answer to your question, Shelley, skip to the last chapter and read that one. But they really seem to me to kind of go with the whole Marxist version of reality. They think that, in part, I think they're open to whatever possibilities and to, building mass movement is of course part of it, but they talk about taking over the means of production. That sounded very Marxist to me.
Nationalizing the means of production?
No.
Well, in individual,
The workers take it over.
individual workplaces take
That's
it
it.
over. And they talk about, that the capitalists, the state is not gonna take that lightly. They're gonna come in and do everything they can to crush that. And, they didn't really go into details about where you were gonna be about it, but, they are talking about a Marxist version of revolution. And, I was able to, or I was glad they went ahead and said that, and but I think that that's not enough, or something that there's got to be other ways to create revolution besides using or coming at it from a Marxist version of focusing on production. Why aren't we focusing on consumption is one thing, and Maria Mize and Veronica Ben Holt-Thompson in the subsistence perspective are going to talk about consumption. What would happen? I'm just throwing something out. What would happen if 1 week we all boycotted one particular fossil fuel company? We boycotted Exxon 1 week. We let them see what we could do about destroying their businesses. And so on. That's just a minor thought. And the next week we went on to Shell, and we showed these companies that as consumers we have all kinds of power to totally screw with their business. And I think a lot of people would go along with something like that.
And that would bring capitalism to its knees if that were done in a mass movement.
It would. And so I don't know why they're not focusing on the consumer end of things. I think that's really important, I'm not against focusing on the production end of things, but really, if you just don't go buy something, how's the state gonna attack you,
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that, we have the real power to make change is by not being consumers and by transitioning our own lives, because capitalism and greed are only propped up by the level of consumption that happens. You can come up with all the products that are not sustainable, and if people don't buy them, you're out of business. And I just feel like somehow there's this hesitancy in our society for people to take bold steps to try to withdraw to the greatest extent possible, and to exchange products with other people, and to go 100% used instead of new. And we have that power, but people won't recognize it, won't claim it.
Well, they argue that we are so saturated with consumption as inherently good that it's so we're silent about that, and there's no protest about that. And this would be an overwhelmingly difficult movement, that is to strike at consumerism. I'm sure
Another issue
they discuss this.
that brings up is the school system because one of the things that I've seen, observed many times, is the way that the school system really works to create factory workers, and that's part of the problem we're dealing with now, is that people who are from childhood on are trained how to just show up to the factory, are having a hard time moving into the knowledge economy, and so it hasn't been working for young people for a while, but one of those other parts of it is a lot of that ends up being consumerism, that people are just pushed on identifying as a consumer, and that's a major part of your identity as an American.
Yes.
I've never liked
I'll just point out that,
thought of it
sorry,
as non-humans.
that they do have several pages on consumerism and consumption. And it's around the subject of what makes true happiness. And there are now happiness codes around the world. And I have one taped to my night table and published in the Democratic Gazette. We're something like 14th in the world in actual happiness. And part of it is that goods, that things, don't actually bring that much happiness. And so they are in different places in this book, acknowledging that. Maybe they tackle too many topics, so we lose sight of what they actually have done. I can't remember what they have done. I have to use their index, and their index is not very good.
You had talked earlier, I was very excited to hear you talking about when you read it, and the Quechua Society. Several years ago, 30 years ago, I was reading a book, I read most of the work of Jose Maria Arguedas, who was raised, he wasn't Quechua, but he was raised among the Quechua Indians, and he wrote about them extensively. And one of the things he talked about was how their societies were destroyed when the Spanish moved in and began to take over their land and destroy their communities. And he just described this one scene of a Quechua Indian looking at some lambs just gambling around on the lawn and saying in Spanish, all they see is numbers. All they see is the meat. All they see is how much money they're going to be getting from these lambs. They don't see the beauty of a lamb playing in the field. You know, and so we're talking about this whole different way of looking at things instead, because capitalism, what it made us do was think that we had to become workers, that we had to produce, just like God is talking about the schools, we have to produce for this society instead of realizing that we're living on this planet in this cosmic field. It's an entirely different way of looking at the world.
I'm thinking of a question, and I'm sure we're all illuminating about it. One of the major ideas of Marx was alienation. That capitalism alienated us from our work, from our fellow beings, and from the things themselves. And so on page 128, those are good pages there, page 128, 133, their analysis of consumerism, that it's emotional compensation for having been alienated because we do not lack control of our workplace. We're always under some boss who makes the rules for us. As well as unequal opportunities. Why are certain groups of people in our country unhappy? Well, especially colored people, they don't have equal opportunity and are alienated from others. And so they had tried to make, but very briefly, that kind of analysis.
I think, Shelley, you kind of gave your own answer to your earlier question about what to do about the people, white supremacists or something. It's like our moment-to-moment experience of life has been really injured terribly by capitalism and patriarchy. And, you know, what you're talking about is the solution to that. It is an important solution to that. If your moment-to-moment experience is to really be able to connect with other people and to really be able to connect with nature and have spiritual experiences and to feel good about yourself, you know, why do you need to hate somebody else if you're having this great experience?
That's
So-
true, and that's the one way that I can connect. Because like, when I'm talking to old conservative friends or old, you know, family, whatever, that's the one thing that they say, I love my neighbors, I care about my community. That's like the one area that's possible.
And the word spiritual is used by these authors. I just now remember several times that they say that's when Revere, or that is the socialist society, that is the eco-socialist society, is to bring artistic modes of experience to all people, that they wouldn't have to be working a long job or 2 jobs or 3 jobs. They would have leisure. Leisure is discussed several times in the book. And then over and over and over again is the principle for the new society, providing full human potential in ways that respect and preserve a healthy, stable biosphere. Constantly bringing together those 2 things, and we will have a good life for all people, but a life that protects our planet at the same time. And capitalism does neither, but it provides the opposite. Anyway,
The big problem is that capitalism does not value the future.
Right.
For example, an economist wants to, did an analysis, and he said under the capitalist system, said the only rational decision to do about whales is to harvest them all right now, and just exterminate them.
yes,
Because capitalism does not value the future, does not put any value on the ecological function, because, it's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to quantify it. And if you can't quantify it, and you're a capitalist, has no value whatsoever.
short-term.
And that's why human happiness has little or no value for capitalists, because they can't quantify it.
Well, in that case, we need to start quantifying the important things in life instead of just money and how many pairs of shoes you can amass.
Well,
and
I
so
cited
forth.
a paper by
So-
Costanza et al., in which they looked at the value of ecosystem services to
That's a good starting.
to the
Yes.
global,
That's one for
they
ecology.
they concluded that the value of ecosystem services that are provided to humanity on an annual basis are greater than the world's gross domestic product.
The problems are basically cultural, and what's valued culturally depends on pretty much what you say you value, what people talk about, what people are interested in. Instead of a gross domestic product as a representation of the value of our nation, how about a happiness quotient instead?
Well, we have that, and that's what I was talking about.
I mean, let's actually replace it.
Norway is the top.
And put other markers in their place. They're surely better, just purely economic markers than the
No
GDP.
doubt about it, but that they.
Some sort of
In a
something
capitalist
that includes
society,
everything, for
they,
instance.
those other alternative markers have no value.
No, they're gonna have to be struggled for, and that would be part of the mass movement that would bring about a change of values.
That's how you get this change, I think, is by changing some of the markers, some of the measuring rules.
Oh, yes. Yes, well, that has been the struggle, and that's part of reform.
I'd like to make a few comments.
Please.
And you mentioned equality before, and that just reminded me of the French Revolution, and how their motto was liberty, equality, fraternity. But that was certainly not nonviolent.
Oh, yeah.
It was extremely violent. The other thing I'm surprised about is that there hasn't been a mention of internationalism, which is a core part of Marxism. The third thing that came to my mind.
Shall I just interject something
Sure.
here? That they have a paragraph or two explaining that their book is about United States capitalism. They're not trying to discuss the entire world. These are internationalists, these
But
guys are.
climate change in particular requires an international
It
solution.
does, it does.
The third thing is we have an opportunity now in Puerto Rico and in a smaller scale, the Virgin Islands, to rebuild the energy economy there after like a mini grid kind of approach or something along those lines, rather than, the current system, they're extremely dependent on diesel generation.
Yes.
So replacing that diesel generation with a renewable energy-based mini-grid kind of situation is an opportunity we have now because it's been wiped out. There is no grid infrastructure.
Right, but
In
under
either
the Trump
place.
administration, they would never take advantage of that.
No, but,
opportunity.
well, the Virgin Islands, for instance, is small enough that private groups could potentially step in and use it as a model. And Hawaii is becoming a model of this right now already. The fourth thing is, I grew up in California. I graduated from high school in 1976. And at that point, there was an ideal by the people who ran the University of California in particular, so that tuition, there